Geraldine O'Neill. I'm in UCD Teaching and Learning. And I would really like to welcome Professor Sally Jordan to this second session that we're doing on online quizzes. It's improving the design and use of your online quizzes. So it's the second in a series. Some of you may have been at the first. Just a little bit of an introduction to Sally again. So Sally is a professor in physics education in the Open University with about 30 years experience in teaching and supporting distance learning students. She was the first person in the university to instigate the online computer marked assessment, as she calls it, about 20 years ago. And she did that, I suppose, to particularly encourage feedback in her students and to motivate students. Over the years, she's led a lot of faculty initiatives, leadership roles, and her research interests are in the use of sophisticated computer marked assessment, also on the impact of assessment on students, equality, diversity, and inclusion. However, she does say she's not a technical expert and sees herself primarily as a higher education teacher. So we're particularly interested in the design of online quizzes, and but as Sally would admit herself that she's not a technical expert. So I'll hand over to you, Sally.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. Can I just double check everyone can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
That's lovely. That's great. Thank you. So it's really nice to be here. It's really nice to have such a diverse group of people here. I'm well aware that today's audience, if you like, includes people who probably know as much as I do. So I absolutely see this as a sharing of experience. It's also nice to see some people back from the first of the webinars a couple of weeks ago. Last time we really help if I got my slides actually moving forward, so it's better. So last time we concentrated on the importance of considering a sort of assessment strategy, starting from assessment strategy, why it was that you were actually setting up a quiz. And then we got through to the point at which we just started thinking about what actual questions might look like, what question types are available. And today, I'm actually going to slightly turn that on its head. We will relatively soon get into thinking about the nitty-gritty of what makes a good online quiz question. As I say, I use the terms computer marked assessment, online quiz, so I'll probably use them interchangeably. So think about question design. And then we'll end going back to revisit assessment strategy and that thorny issue of what we think about the whole sort of plagiarism thing around online quizzes. An interesting discussion on that last time, which we'll revisit. So I'm just showing a couple of slides at the beginning, which apologies for those who were here last time, that repeats, but they are really, really important things. So although we're parking the bigger issue of what the assessment strategy is that you're working within, I think it's really important you don't lose sight of that, so that all the time you are thinking, actually, why is it? Why am I choosing to use these things? Am I doing them because I want to mark a lot of, I've got a lot of student numbers, I want to mark a lot of things, I want to do it in a fairly objective way? Or is my focus on engaging, motivating, giving students feedback, those kinds of things? Now they can exist together, and we'll come back and explore that. But nevertheless, keep in mind, why it is that you're doing them and how. The other thing, which is perhaps a little less clear, is to bear in mind when we get into the issue of how an individual question works, don't forget that there's also the issue as to how the quiz as a whole works. So what I mean by that is, do you, for example, want students to be able to repeat the whole quiz, once or as many times as you want them to? Within the quiz, within Brightspace, incidentally, I'm not a Brightspace expert, I'm absolutely not. But within the quiz, do you want students to be able to do, as I believe you can, which is if they get an answer wrong the first time, to have another go? it's something that you need to think about. Similarly, do you want to give students feedback? And the options that you have are essentially feedback on a whole quiz, feedback on a whole question, and none of these are mutually exclusive, by the way, or feedback on the individual options that they've picked, or indeed on a particular incorrect answer if it's a free text question. So those are all things to bear in mind, and that little bit in red at the top highlights the fact that although we're in a slightly artificial scenario today, because we're all here, we're from a range of different discipline areas, you would normally want to operate that kind of decision with colleagues so that the poor students aren't doing one quiz in one module that operates in a particular way and another quiz in another module that operates in a different way, because we've got a fair bit of evidence that they do get really confused, and it's not surprising. So just bear that in mind. But then we come on to, if you like, the nitty-gritty, which is what we're going to be concentrating on this morning. And I've got another slide that explains that in more detail. So we will come back to this slide quite a lot during this morning. And it's the important things to bear in mind when you are actually writing a question. So the first thing is we'll explore what range of question types you've got available in more detail in a moment. But do stop and think, am I actually using the best question type for what it is I want to assess? Actually, I'm going to say that's the most important thing, and then I'll come on to the next one and say that's the most important thing as well, because it's like that. So the question the question wording, and I will revisit this one a lot as well, is getting the question meaning clear is actually really difficult. It's amazing. You write a question, you think it's clear, but it's not clear to your students. It's very easy to lapse into using double negatives. The other thing we were laughing about in my own context at the UK University, Open University, is that what we have a tendency to do is if you write a question and then you discover that it's not somehow being interpreted in the way that you expect it to be being interpreted, you put more instructions in and the whole thing gets longer and longer and longer, so that the instructions are longer than the question you're asking in the first place. So try to keep it simple, try to keep it clear. Then clearly you need to think about what's the, if you like, the target answer. What is it you're expecting students to answer? Are there different ways of saying that? What wrong answers are you expecting? If you're using a multiple choice question, what are the distractors that you're going to be offering? And then, as discussed, think about the feedback. Now, we talked, I mentioned that we'd return to plagiarism at the end. And last time we talked a little bit about whether you might want to provide variants of questions. Now, there's two ways in which that can work. If you're writing essentially a numerical question, you can operate with different students seeing different numbers, essentially. And that's quite easy to do. It can be done in Brightspace. There are dangers, but it can be done. If you're operating in a more qualitative subject, then you can choose for the options that a student is seeing to appear in different orders. You can actually choose to have different questions that the system is picking from a question bank. So there are ways in which you can do that. Obviously, it adds the complexity of writing the question. And of course, at the end of the day, it depends what you're doing it for. But do bear in mind that variants of the question are an easy way of discouraging plagiarism, if you want to discourage plagiarism. They're also quite a good way of providing extra opportunities for a student to have another go, for them to practice the question, if that's what you want to achieve. And the final point that I will come back to multiple times is essentially this bit at the end, which could be summed up as check, check, check again. So go back, look at your own questions. Is it really doing what I wanted to do? Then get a colleague to check it. Now that's the joy of how we're working this morning. You will be working with other people. What do they think? And then You still won't always get it right. I'll be giving you some examples in a moment. I haven't always got it right. Students can be misled by the things that you really, really, really didn't expect. So do just keep an eye on how your students are actually getting on. And don't assume that just because it's a really simple, really straightforward question that any idiot can do, that it will be interpreted that way. And it's you that's the idiot if your students interpret it in a completely different way from the way you'd expected. So I'm just going to go on to explore this a little bit more. So I'm actually taking a backwards approach, if you like. I'm in the fortunate position of having a massive number of questions which we've used, massive number of quizzes. And what are some of the things that we've found about the way our quizzes perform? Now, those of you that don't particularly like statistics will be over these first couple of slides really quickly. Most systems, and I believe that that's true of Brightspace, these are Moodle statistics you've got in front of you, actually churn out statistical measures of how a quiz as a whole is performing. I've just done, I'm in the middle actually of a review of all of the interactive computer marked assessment quiz questions on a particular module at the OU. So I've actually been deep into these things. And it's quite a useful starting point, but I don't hang around on it for very long, even though I do know a reasonable amount about statistics. What you've got in front of you there is the statistics that were spewed out for 2 runs of the same module using the same quiz questions. So one started at 20J, started in October 2020, 21B started in February of this year. And the first thing that you might notice if you are sort of into statistics is we are not getting a nice sort of bell-shaped distribution of the scores on the quiz. And you are quite unlikely to do that. If I go on to what it actually looks like, that makes it clearer. It was a very, very simple quiz. It was, there were only 5 questions. There were lots of ways in which the 5 marks for the 5 questions could be obtained. It wasn't just whole marks. But you can see that at the end of the day, most people are getting all the questions right. I would say that's something to be aware of. Personally, it doesn't bother me, but again, you might want to think about how well the thing's discriminating. So still with numbers, I'm afraid, but this is where it gets a weeny bit more interesting. So that was for the quiz as a whole. I'm drilling down into it, and I'm now looking at how, for this particular quiz, how it performed at the whole question level. And each of the 5 questions has got 5 variants, whether the variants are behaving in the same way. So what you've actually got, I'll take the top one first, question 1. Facility index is the same as mean, by the way. It's basically what the mean mark all the students who got that variant or that question or whatever got. So for the 2 presentations, for question 1, the mean is high, very high. Again, that might bother you. In this particular context, it doesn't. The second thing is for those 5 variants, what was the range? What was the range of means? Well, there's a couple of percentage points difference between the different variants. What I'm about to say you might find shocking, but the simple fact is that does not bother me. If it bothers you, I would stop and say, for this particular quiz, it did have some light, very, very low stakes summative function. Actually, the whole quiz contributes 1% to a level 1 student score on that module. It's tiny percentage. Any variation there is absolutely tiny overall. And remember how flaky we are as human markers. It's absolutely nothing in comparison. So that really, really, really doesn't bother me. There's some further down there that do give me more cause for concern. But just in case you were thinking this is a big thing, can you look right down at the bottom, question 5? The first thing to note is that it's about, again, it's actually only about a 3 percentage point difference in the average marks for different variants. It just looks more because it goes from 50 something to 60 something. The other thing is that the 2 presentations, variant 2 was the most difficult in one of the presentations, but it was the easiest in the other. In other words, it's not a real effect, it's just statistical noise. But the one above it, yes, there's something in there that I want to investigate. I want to drill down and see why it is that some of the variants are behaving differently from others. And you can do that. So moving on to the next slide, this is where you, I'm going to get you to begin to think, if you like. So this isn't actually a real question, but it's very, very like a real issue that we've had. So some person thought that they would write a question, which is, it's chemistry. I think we've got some chemists in the audience. I know there's a lot of people from a vaguely medical background. And it's basically a very simple sort of knowledge-based question. People have got to, students are asked to enter a free text answer. That's doable, very much doable within what you've got within Brightspace for each of those symbols. So each student would see, you know, for example, what element does the chemical symbol, and they might get Cu, and what does that represent? And the right answer would be copper. So using the chat box and without any detailed knowledge of chemistry, can anybody think about which of those variants students might have found more difficult? There's a lot of people thinking this is chemistry and it's early morning. Okay, so a lot of people are saying Fe for iron. I'm guessing that that's because the symbol doesn't give the clue. If you know that's right. Actually, the one, and a couple of people are now saying Al for aluminium. Again, there's a couple of issues with that, which I'll come back to. So there's various. Actually, the most difficult by quite some measure was sulfur. And that's because there are 2 ways of spelling sulfur in common use. I have put there the way that whatever the body is that governs naming of chemical substances. But common usage would put a PH, not an F. And that hadn't been marked right. Aluminium, the point about iron is a good one. I've got an example with that aluminium thing, which is real. It was a real shock to me. The way around it is at the moment, of course, again, aluminium might be spelt aluminum. And so that is something that could cause issues if people are having to type it in. But the other way round with that is that if you were asked to write what the symbol was for aluminium, if people have only seen that in writing, you might write A1, not AL, which is what it's meant to be. And that has happened to me in real life. So I think the point I'm trying to make is have a quick scan through the actual responses that you're getting, because it will teach you quite a lot. So that's that. Well done, everybody. Thank you for engaging. So this is another real example, and this is a real example of a really simple question. Completely doable as a free text question, but I have literally just discovered that we've got some problems with it. It exists in multiple variants, but they all do the same thing. So we're being really clever. We're accepting answers whether they're given in square meters or square centimeters, or whether they're given in scientific notation or they're not given in scientific notation. And the answer matching up to that point is behaving perfectly. There was nothing in the statistics that highlighted any problem until I started, first of all, getting student complaints and then actually looking to see what was going on. And at that point, I discovered the marking's fine for those answers that we're wanting. But I found two issues. Now, the first one is that the symbol for a meter is a little lowercase m, but the system was actually marking meters with a capital M as correct. It isn't. It really isn't. I don't want my students to be thinking that. I do want to give feedback if that's all that's wrong with their answer, because some of you remember one of the student quotes from last time when all they'd done was get the letter, the wrong case. You need to give feedback, but you really shouldn't be marking it as correct. And that's just sloppy that somebody's done that badly. The other thing is, this is something that those of you who work in numeric disciplines, we could discuss forever. But the academic who was writing the questions at the time had a real thing about whether, and that sort of question does only arise, that's right, if they're automatically marked, but there are similar issues. It's nevertheless also right to actually to check when they're not automatically marked. You're absolutely right that's the case, and it's something to watch out for. The issue of the space, one of the advantages to doing it with using free text questions, if you really, really, really want there to be a space, if you insist there must be a space before the units, then fair enough. But to my mind, that's really just being a little bit unfair when there's, so what I'm really thinking is be careful what it is you're assessing, essentially. So I'm going to finish this little section on finding out about what's wrong about questions by looking at the student responses with a real example. It's a real example of a question that I wrote. And I was oh so pleased with this question. It was me working with a geologist. I'll tell you what the right answer is in a minute. But I thought, oh, okay, we had to have a figure description because we wanted a picture description because it was a, it's got a picture in there. It sort of made it real life. It's I don't know if anybody knows the south coast of Devon. It's got, if you're on the train, you go past these things. And all I'm wanting to do is students to use the evidence that they've got in front of them to find out what that red coloured rock and what it tells you in the wording about the grains of the rock, what it tells you about the origin. And the correct answer is that it was formed somewhere dry and it was windborne, it was airborne. So like dry and windy were the right answers, and the answer matching, the thing to bear in mind is the answer matching all the way through has been absolutely perfect. That's not the issue. The problem was that, oops, I've given the clue away, that the problem was that the students didn't know how long their answer was to be. That was the first thing. And so most of them just wrote a few words, but some of them wrote, hundreds of words, quite literally. And the other thing it did was it encouraged people to Google, because basically we wanted them to work it out, but I've said it's Dawlish. I might have wanted them to look up Dawlish, but on this occasion I didn't. I wanted them to work out the answer and get there by themselves by giving the name of where the rock is and giving a clue for those who knew where it is. People Googled the place And we ended up with some of these really long answers that actually described the complete geology of Dawlish. And what it did is it gave the right answer. It talked about it being a dry environment and it being a windborne thing. And then it told me about the deposits underneath and it told me about the deposits on top. And so there was a right answer, but also a wrong answer. And it dealt with, it did both of those things. So lovely question. It's going a long way. It's going a long way because you are asking students to think, to not just take the options that are given in front of them. But it was problematic in its wording. So we reworded it. Okay, so I've reworded that question. And this was real. To the version you've got in front of you there. What do you think happened? So we've not identified Dawlish. We've said give your answer as a short phrase or sentence, which is what we wanted. Answers for more than 20 words won't be accepted, which they weren't. What do you think happened to the answers we've got from our students? Do anybody type it in the chat box? The clue is in the answers more than 20 words won't be accepted. I'm wishing I'd got the distribution of lengths to show you. What actually happened was everybody gave answers that were 19 words long. So you only need 3 words to answer that question, but everybody saw the whole thing and thought, right, it is a clue here. It's not going to mark more than 20 words. So I'm going to write as many as I possibly can to get an answer. So why I've included this example is essentially just to bear in mind the false message that our question wording can give, and it can give that for any question. Students interpreting it may not see the question the same way as you saw it. That was exactly what happened. I should have known better. It was my fault. So we're nearly there. We changed it to just being a short phrase or sentence. We thought we were there, but we still weren't there. And that was because the answer, as I say, is dry and windy. A lot of people were giving the answer of it's formed in a desert, but a desert doesn't necessarily mean it's been formed by air, because you get flash flooding, all sorts of things. And the question author, the academic I was working with, only wanted the dry bit to be accepted. That was only the dry, not the windy, if you like. So what we did, the final version, and it worked absolutely perfectly, was to leave it as it was, but to give targeted feedback if they just said it was formed in a desert. And this was a question where our students were allowed 3 goes at it. And over on the graphs beneath show the percentage who were right at the first try, right at the second try, right at the third try, and didn't get it right at all. And what changed between the 2 presentations we were using that question was that whereas in the first presentation, if you didn't get it right at the first go, the feedback we gave wasn't terribly helpful. You didn't get it right at the second go either. Whereas just putting that targeted feedback in at the second go meant that people had a chance, if they were nearly right, of actually then getting to the right answer. So a final 2 examples I've got from what you can learn from questions are 2 examples. I'm back now in the what are selected response questions. These are actually multi-select questions in the Brightspace terminology. They're multiple response questions. And it's what you can learn about actually what it is that your students are doing wrong. And don't worry about the detail of this. It's a lovely question. It's a really easy question to write because and it exists in various variants, and there's no issue with the variants. But the two right responses are indicated, and by seeing which actual responses students give, you can see what it is that they do or don't understand about giving answers to three significant figures. The other variants there are not randomly chosen. They're all chosen for a particular reason. And in fact, the two right responses are the ones that are chosen most frequently. But the 4.5, one that starts 4.50, that's the one that's chosen the most often. And if people get that one right, they very often also give 300 meters as the right answer, which it isn't, because there is a particular clue in there, the way they're thinking, and you begin to discover what their misunderstanding is as you look at that. And the final example I've got, which was again a real one, very early piece of work for me. It was, everybody says, oh, students can't rearrange equations. Actually, if you teach them well, they can. What they actually couldn't do with that, the correct answer for that question is 1.6 seconds, not seconds to -1. And it's not that they're not trying to get the right units. They all tried. There were marks on this. They were trying to give the right answer, but they didn't understand. And basically, do you know what? They didn't understand fractions. Not anything difficult. It was that thing that you learn at primary school about how you actually divide by a fraction. And that was the underpinning misunderstanding. And actually we altered our teaching because of that, because we realized what the understanding was there. So you can learn a lot. So for the remaining time till we have a little break, I'm going to move on to talk about the different question types that you might want to use. And we've already raised the issue of ones that are automatically marked and ones where it's pre-selected. And I'll use the word selected response for ones where you're picking from an option, and constructed response where you're working it for yourself. And the first three there, the true or false, multiple choice, multiple select, are all, they're all selected response. The options are there for you just to tick. Short answer is like the ones that I've just been showing you with the sandstone question. Give some more examples of that in a minute. I'll give more examples of the arithmetic and significant figures question types in a minute. I'm not going to go on in great detail about matching and ordering, so I will just describe what they are quickly now. So matching, I talked about last time. Matching is where you've essentially got two lists of things that you want to match one thing to another. So the example that's given in the Brightspace training is a list of books and a list of authors, and it's the link up who wrote which book. Bit fun, bit different. The Brightspace version of it doesn't have accessibility issues, which the Moodle one does, so that's good. But do just watch that what you think might be a game, so somebody's linking up one thing with something else that's like it, might become a little irritating to students, and you might not actually be assessing quite what it is you want to assess. So if you've, say, got 5 books that you want to link to 5 authors, and somebody knows 3 of them dead easily, then those remaining 2, it kind of becomes guesswork, and you're just working out, you know, what's what with it. That might be fine, but do bear in mind that students might actually be doing it not on the basis of their knowledge, and they might also be doing it it might get rather annoying if you're nearly there and then told you're wrong. Similarly, the ordering example, I talked about that last time. Ordering is really useful. It's basically which of these things happened first, or which of these things is the older, which of these things is the bigger. But if it depends on the detail of how the marking works, if a student just gets 2 of them slightly wrong, whereas they've got a great long list of things right, and is then told they're wrong, it can be really, really, really frustrating. And the other example I gave last time is an example where, to be honest, it's dates of something was invented back in the dim and distant past. Just how sure are we that the ordering we're saying is right? So be careful, but they're useful question types. The other one I'm not going to describe in detail is the true or false question. That is quite literally, is this true or is this false? In its simple form, to be honest, I wouldn't use it because apart from anything else, there's a 50% chance of getting it right by guesswork, so-called random guess score. The other thing is, if you do use it, and again, there's a fairly hideous example we talked about last time, but real from training material, where the example of is it true that the sky is blue? And the person that was demonstrating this clearly thought it was a really good example because everybody knows that the sky is blue. Well, is it? You know, it's a dubious thing. You aren't actually as sure of that as you think, and that's perhaps one of the dangers of constructed selected response questions. You know, be sure that the options are as you think they are. So let's have a more detailed look at some of the question types. So I'll emphasize before I open my mouth to criticize this question, which I'm then going to do fairly roundly, that I don't have anything against multiple choices questions per se. I would hesitate to use just multiple choice. I think you want to use the range of question types that are available to you. But actually really, really simple questions like this one should be, can be used for what Stephen Draper describes as catalytic assessment. In other words, a really, really, really simple thing that gets people thinking. So nothing against multiple choice questions per se, just lots against this question. So we talked about last time, frankly, I would just look at that and think, I don't think it's either none of the above or an angle is needed to answer this question. So there's 2 of the options there that are redundant. I really, really, really wouldn't give that or that nothing option at the end because they're sort of different, you know, there. The other thing is that actually seeing the options and seeing that they're all whole numbers, I think, oh, there's something interesting about this question. And I can do it really, really quickly. It's for those of you that sort of know trigonometry, it's a 3, 4, 5 triangle. The answer in this particular instance is 12 centimeters. So it's a an easy one to work out very quickly. Maybe that's what the question author wanted. But the other thing for this one, to be honest, is why ask this as a multiple choice question? You could, if you want students to find the answer, they can find the answer and type 12. You could give them the units. You could tell them it was centimeters. So you don't have to do anything fancy in the answer matching. And that way the students are having to think about it rather than just go to the options. I do, however, want to come back to emphasize this point that really simple question types can be used to assess quite advanced things. I'm not sure I'm going quite as far as higher level, high order learning skills, but nevertheless, things that really, really, really make a student stop and think. This is a slightly complicated question. That's one of the things I've maybe got against it. And ignore the bit about only having 1 to 2 attempts. That's to do with our system. But basically what a student is looking for here are the 2, it's very topical at the moment. So GMST is global mean standard temperature. It's about global warming. Which of these 2 things, one of them would increase global warming, one of them would decrease global warming? So you need to think about it. You need to think about which of those 2 things might at once cause no effect. and go through and work it out. So I think on balance, it's a pretty good question, even if it is a bit complicated. So these are multiple select questions. This is another example of a multiple select question where students are ticking multiple options. Now, but there are a few things to bear in mind with using multiple select, which you just need to be aware of if you're going to be doing this sort of thing. So the first thing is that we tend to say how many of the statements are true. You don't have to, but if you don't tell them how many, if you don't tell students how many are true, again, it can turn into a bit of a guessing game. And that can be incredibly frustrating for students. The other two things to bear in mind are think about how you're going to have the thing marking. Now, within Brightspace, you can choose to mark just exactly what's right, the exact 3 answers that are correct, or you can choose to mark the answers that are correct as correct, and then anything that students have given as incorrect, then they take away. Or you can choose to mark what's correct and ignore others. Now, the danger with that is if somebody ticked all of the boxes, they would have got the right ones, but they wouldn't have got the others. So stop and think about, how you want the question to work. And the final point with that question is that there's various ways in which the options can appear. You can choose to have the options appearing in a random order for different students, but bear in mind that some students will get the first 3 options as the first 3. So if they go working down, they wouldn't actually need to look at the others, they'd just do the first 3. So various things to just think about in that. I've got 2 more examples. And I was going to go live, but I want to be able to concentrate on you having a go with some of these question types. So I'm not going to. If we get time at the end, I can show you. Now, you'll realise from what I was saying with the Sandstone question earlier, that there are, that these short answer questions are something that I've done a lot of work on. We've got them so that students actually type their answers as a sentence up to 20 words. No issues with that at all. You can use them. There is a short answer question type within Brightspace. You can use them to mark single word answers like those chemical symbols we gave before. But you have 3 options to do with the way in which the answer matching works. You can just match exactly what's been typed with where the case of what you've written matters or the case doesn't matter. Or you can use something called regular expressions behind the scenes. Now, if you use regular expressions, you can do everything we do, but it is quite complicated to use. So if you really get fired up by this area of work, very happy to talk with you separately about the way in which you can do it, because again, you can use this question quite powerfully. Although the Sandstone question was a bit sort of knowledge-based, this one here, it's not really, because it's saying, okay, well, I alter this, what happens? And what you're actually looking for is the false will decrease by a factor of 4. And it's perfectly possible to get the answer matching in that does that. Other things to bear in mind, to be careful with in this sort of question is, if I'd actually by mistake typed the force will decease instead of decrease, it would actually have marked that right, because I've got something in there that's watching after the spell checking that's going on. But just be careful of that. But potentially, if your imagination gets fired by this sort of thing and you're wanting to set up some questions, this question type is really, really, really quite a powerful one, and it is available to you. The other question type that's available to you, and I don't know if there's people who are here who are interested in it or not, so I'm not going to dwell on this. There are the 2 question types that I alluded to at the end, which are the arithmetic question type and the significant figures question type. They're basically very similar. they're useful for answering numerical questions, and you can give ranges. So I have written this particular question, which I believe I did write many years ago, has got various slightly different variants, which for one lot of effort are used in lots of modules all over the place. But one of the things to bear in mind is that if you're having ranges of values, that they need to be of equivalent difficulty if it matters to you. So this variance of this question would ask you to express different numbers to 2 significant figures, 3 significant figures, 4 significant figures. That's actually a very small number. It's got all those zeros before the 395. I also do it for very big numbers, but I wouldn't have those in the same assessment because they're assessing subtly different skills. And similarly, this one here requires people, the correct answer for this is 4.0 times 10 to the minus 5. People have had to round that up to quite a difficult number. Some answers you might give are an awful lot easier. So in using a range of values, just think, are they of equivalent difficulty? So I want to just come back to revisit that. Why are we using computer marked assessment? And I'd reiterate that if you weren't here at the last one of these workshops, there was quite an interesting discussion around some of these things, which I'll try and summarize now, but do just bear it in mind as well. So this whole thing of formative and summative, and when our colleague, I'm not naming because of the recorder, but when our colleague was talking just now, they said very much want it to be, it's summative, therefore there's no feedback. Now, in the use that we've made of summative questions, we do actually sometimes give feedback because, as I say, they're not necessarily one thing or the other. I do understand that in certain disciplines, particularly medical disciplines, that there may be a fitness to practice issue, and it may be assumed that things are summative, and that's the end of the story. You can't give feedback, but it is perfectly possible for students to have multiple tries and have feedback, and you give them a lower score if they didn't get it right at the first go. And so you are still giving some sort of feedback in there. The other thing to bear in mind, which we talked about at length last time, was the issue of whether or not people would actually, whether students would understand the same thing as we do by this formative summative thing. If for what I'm talking about is there's a mark associated with it, but I want to do it for formative reason. Do our students understand the same thing as I do? And actually, again, picking up on well, it's summative, so we don't give feedback. There may be some truth in that, because I'm very much sort of into this, well, we can still give feedback even if it's summative. But actually, our students don't always understand the same thing that we do. It might be that we think we're doing this because we want to encourage learning, but actually our students are just seeing the mark, and that's all that matters to them is getting it right. And maybe that's no bad thing. So it's just to be aware of that. So I just want to, and again, do use the chat box if you've any thoughts about other ways in which we might engage with online quizzes as part of an assessment strategy. So what I've got there are a couple of ideas of things that we've done, and a couple of ideas that come from the things we talked about in the workshop a fortnight ago, and a couple of others. So the first thing I want to talk about is the potential use of not actually having the quizzes carrying a mark themselves, but then in a later assignment, asking students to reflect on what they've learned from it. And I would say we've done that and it can work quite well. So that's the top example. The second example is one that we tried across the science faculty at the university a few years ago now. And it wasn't my idea, but we decided that for the continuous assessment during the year, rather than it being purely formative, or rather than it being summative, which is what we'd always done historically, we'd give feedback, but it would also count towards the grade, that we would actually introduce what we called formative thresholded assessment, which meant that students needed to get over a certain very low threshold, which encouraged them to engage. But they would, but it wouldn't actually count towards their overall score. I was very, very skeptical about this, but it worked incredibly well. The significant thing for what we're talking about now is it worked well, particularly if you allowed, if you were really just looking at a threshold on the quiz level, and we were saying things like you need to get more than 30% in 7 out of 10 of the quizzes. And basically students engaged and engaged and engaged with it and weren't cheating. I'll come back to that point in a minute. It can be useful as a trigger. You can use it in class. You can say, I've got this quiz, and encourage discussion. You could use it as a trigger for them to actually look up the information, not necessarily being a memory game. You can use it to reveal what a student understands. I understand those who've got to go. Well, we'll keep the recording coming. Thank you for letting me know. And at the end of the day, you could use it for students to have a go at writing questions themselves in something called PeerWise as an example of that. We talked last time about the ways in which you can prevent plagiarism in quizzes. And we talked about introducing tight timing, shuffling questions. But when we talked about it last time, we were really quite anxious about most of those things because of the potential, put timing on a quiz and the stress that that introduces for students. We've talked about using question variants, nothing wrong with that, or pulling random questions from a library, but they may be of different difficulty. Somebody's talked about the fact that different questions may take students a different length of time to do. But I hope you'll realise that where I've been driving to through all of this in both workshops has been if you get the meaning of your questions clear and think very clearly about what you're wanting to do, plagiarism perhaps becomes less of an issue. Because coming back to that formative thresholded assessment, the second one there, students could have cheated. They could have repeated the questions round in different variants, and they would see in the feedback exactly the answer we wanted them to give. A few students did do that, but if they did it because they didn't understand. It was very clear that students were only doing it when that was their last resort. If the student's clear on what they're meant to do, then it simply doesn't happen. So my final couple of slides. So I've shown you some question types that maybe are ones that you haven't used before. You can go further. There are question type stack, which is a question type using computer algebra, code runner, which is where somebody writes a computer program and it's actually assessed. They'll come, they are available. They're not currently available in Brightspace. The interesting thing is that actually at the end of the day, you can go an awful long way. You can get, if you want somebody, not short answer, whole essays, you can mark them really, really accurately. But is that what you want to do? Because are you really marking the communication skills in that essay, or is it some proxy? And Pellman did a very interesting piece of work, which is much documented, where he kind of fooled the system into giving him really good marks, but it was a complete nonsense essay. So this is what I think, and I think it's probably just, again, thinking about that group 4 question that we've seen, there's an awful lot you can do using really, really, really short answer questions, simple questions, and that frees up staff time and the staff time can then be used more profitably in other ways. And that is the end point. I've got a slide with references on, which I'll go to, but I'd like to start by doing that. There's an interesting one, so I've just seen it's come up, a suggestion about asking students how confident they are in their answers. That's a good idea. You know, you can use confidence-based marking. I don't have a problem with confidence-based marking. I have a bit of a problem with negative marking, but it's an interesting one. Lots of interesting ways of doing this. So those are the references. And as I say, I guess we'll take the recording off from here onwards. But thank you, everybody, for your time.